Hi everyone, US Chess expert Caruana here. In this video, we're going to be recapping some of the games that happened in round 2 of the Sinquefield Cup and the Cairns Cup. I'll try and do it as quickly as I can because I know that with 10 games we can have quite a long recap, so we will try and get into it as quickly as possible. But just to mention, the Sinquefield Cup and the Cairns Cup used to both be part of the candidates qualification cycle in their role in the Grand Chess Tour and Women's Grand Chess Tour, I believe. But now they're really only part of the FIDE circuit with the change in the total World Chess Championship. So we will be seeing still some very, very high level games. These games are hosted, or rather, these tournaments are hosted by the St. Louis Chess Club in Missouri, and we get to see some of the top players duke it out annually. So without further ado, we'll get into it. I did choose to make this recap because I haven't seen that many other recaps on YouTube on these events, which I think are pretty high profile. So personally, I like to sometimes go ahead and watch videos that are recapping these games just to follow along the tournaments, so I figured that it might be useful for some viewers that would like to follow along as well. Alright, let's go ahead and get started. Also, and one last thing to mention, I am trying to hide the results of the games initially, so the only time when you might see the result is when I go to a new tab or I go to the new game, and it initially um, it'll initially start at the end of the game, and you might see the position, um, but I have an extension that removes the pop-ups that show the result. So hopefully you will be able to ignore that for just a second if you don't want to get spoiled. But let's get into it. All right. So in this first game, we have a game between Pragg and Sindarov. Sindarov and Pragg did play in the candidates tournament, and Sindarov did beat Pragg 2-0. He won both of his matches against Pragg, and in this game they end up going for the same line that they went for in the candidates, with Sindarov having the black pieces. And if you recall, Sindarov won a very nice sacrificing game in that one, so Pragg is definitely looking to try and change things up a little bit. And he does play for a little bit of a different setup where he plays g4 h5. Actually, I will also be turning the analysis on just so you can see the evaluation bar. So just to, if you're curious about the initial evaluation, nothing much happening really, but we get some interesting dynamics and a trade of bishops, where after these moves castles, long castles and short castles, we have opposite side castling, so both sides are trying to attack each other. And after rook e8, knight g3, pawn to f6 is actually a pretty decent position for black after he captures on f4. So Sindarov is doing quite well here because he's putting some pressure on the f4 pawn. But after knight e2, knight c e2, which is important because if you play knight g e2, that you run into some issues with g4 potentially. So after knight c e2, even though black can try and put some pressure, Pragg finds this very nice move, knight to f4, arguing that if you do end up taking on f4, then you can run into some trouble with the open e-file being quite vulnerable. And in particular, if you try to grab another pawn, then you run into a tactic with knight h6 and then rook to g1. So that's not really playable. And because of that, white is arguing for compensation of the pawn in the form of more activity. And Sindarov chooses not to go for that and instead gives the bishop. We get queen to d2 and a trade of queens. But this endgame is actually quite pleasant for Pragg because he ends up having kind of some weaknesses to target, where the pawns are a little bit split and white's pawn structure is quite healthy. So we get the e4 trades, and then eventually Pragg has kind of a nice bind against the king and ultimately ends up winning a pawn. Get rook to b5, check, and this is objectively still a draw because black should be able to sacrifice the knight for the two pawns, but he cannot force it, and Pragg can just keep playing on for quite a while and trying to grind this position. Ultimately, maybe here knight takes c4 would have been the more accurate move, and just trying to argue that this rook endgame is a draw, but actually it's also not so clear here. So just objectively unpleasant, and eventually we get a mistake by Sindarov where he allows this move knight to d4, which probably what he missed was that after knight e2, white can play knight takes f4 and then transition to a completely winning rook and two pawns versus rook endgame. So he tries to complicate things with king to d5, but Pragg calculates quite well, where he goes for rook to d8 and is simply pushing his pawns. And ultimately, we get this position where, even though Sindarov can try to play f2 and promote, we have a7, f1 queen, but then there's rook takes f1, and this is a winning position because after rook takes a7, rook to f5, rook to d7, we have knight takes d5, which is the key move, because if the king takes the pawn, then we have knight to f7 check, knight to f6 check, which is important because rook and knight versus rook is a draw. And then if rook takes, then we have rook takes, king takes, and king to b4, and you ultimately get a winning pawn endgame like this with opposition. So very nice game by Pragg. Let's move on to the next one, which was a game played between Divya, Deshmukh, and Alice Lee, where Divya and Alice are both players that participated in the Women's Speed Chess Championship, and Alice actually won that event. She took down some very, very strong players, including Juan Jun, Ho Yifan. She beat Alexandra Kostenuik in the first round. And overall, she had a very, very dominant performance, so extremely impressive by her. And Divya also had a very, very nice round one in the Women's Speed Chess Championship, where she went undefeated against Rose Atwell. So both Alice and Divya have had very good streaks in the Speed Chess Championship. I think they've both gone on 9 out of 10 runs in their participation. So we will see how they fare in classical chess. By the way, I've also actually played a casual game against Alice before, where she gave me some time odds. I was around 1900 at the time, and she was able to beat me, so she's a very, very strong player. I don't think that needs to be emphasized, really, but just kind of a fun anecdote. Although I did actually get kind of close to drawing, but that's another story. Okay, so here we have the Roy Lopez opening, and I'll turn the evaluation on, where Alice goes for this Cosio setup, which is not as often employed nowadays as it maybe used to be in older times, but this is one of the main lines of the setup, and we get knight takes d4, and ultimately kind of, I think here was maybe some deviation, where after queen takes d6, b3 was maybe a bit of a slower way of playing the position. Just note that knight takes c3 is not a tactic that wins material, because simply this knight is actually pinned. So we proceed with this, bishop a3, and Divya has kind of damaged Alice's pawn structure, though she's also a bit lower on time, and she tries to play for this move queen f3, and Alice ultimately chooses to sacrifice the exchange, where we get a position like this, and Alice calculated this quite well, because after rook to d1, f3, even though she's losing the piece back, she ends up winning the exchange back, so she ends up winning material and actually gets an extra pawn in this rook endgame. And after this we have h4, king to b7, and here was maybe the objective mistake, though it's an extremely unpleasant position regardless. Apparently Divya had to play rook to e6. The difference with rook e6 and rook f6 is that rook f6 would allow rook to d5 check, and now the king cannot advance via this f6 square, and if it goes king h6, then there's just rook h5 check. So if the king, if the rook had gone to e6, then after rook to d5, the king can still try to put some pressure on the h and g pawns. If black tries to play this, then there's still g3. So this would objectively have still maybe been a draw, but definitely quite difficult. And the issue with rook a1 is that maybe in the future there will be some tempting winning moves on the rook with the black king. But ultimately what happens is that we get some advancement, and Divya is low on time and can't really find any practical ways of holding his position, so ultimately she loses the game. So very, very nice game by Alice, and let's go ahead and move on to the third game, where we have a match where we have a match between Levon and Vincent, both European players. And Vincent hasn't been as active over the board as Levon maybe, but Levon has also been in quite good form. Vincent was in great form when he was playing though, so both very strong players. And in this game. By the way, Levon was doing quite well in the. He did okay in the St. Louis Rapid and Blitz, and then he did win a tournament before that. I fail to recall which one, but um, he has been in quite decent form, regardless. Um, so here we get a reverse Benoni position, a3, h3, and this is apologies I didn't turn on the eval bar. So this is a relatively decent setup for black. I've played this myself, or rather a similar setup myself in a classical game where the center for black is often just very difficult to dismantle. Even if you do get this bishop on g2, it's not always really adequate compensation for the center. But Vincent tries to force things a little bit, and tries to create some dynamics where he gives up the center. And he does get quite a nice position here if he plays h4, which he does, and knight f3 check. Maybe the most accurate move here would have been knight h2, and after king f1, no, okay, so I guess he probably should have gone rook a8 was maybe the more accurate move, and try to infiltrate that way, but very, very small differences in the evaluation, where we ultimately get rook e5 and then a trade on f3, but Levon is down to 1 minute. He's under some severe time pressure and pressure on the board, and he makes a mistake, allowing rook d8, and he finally reaches move 40 though, and has to try and defend this position. Vincent brings the rook in, and the white king is slowly getting hunted towards the edge of the board, but it's actually not so clear how you win this position. And actually, Vincent was down to just a couple minutes in trying to figure this out. This is definitely not an easy one to win, even though it looks like it's completely winning on the surface. Levon actually found kind of a way to maybe make it complicated, because there's only really one concrete way, maybe two, but I think there's just one main concrete way of winning this position, which is very subtle. But the way that you're supposed to win this position is after this and this. Here, the best move would have been queen to d1 check, where after king to a3 there would be simply rook c3 check, but after queen b3 you have to find this continuation queen a1, queen a3, and queen to f1. The issue with playing queen f1 immediately is that there's simply queen takes f7 and you are getting checkmated, so the inclusion of queen a1 is to force the queen to a3, and now if the rook takes, what happens is that after king h6, also just to note, if white tries to capture the rook, then there's simply queen to b5 mate. So after rook takes f7, king h6, there is simply no real way for for white to defend the position, because black is kind of generally threatening to win the queen via removing the defender of the king, the defender of the queen, which is the king. So if something just random, say like rook e7, then you have queen b5, king b3, and rook to c3. Not here. Sorry, so queen a6, and then rook to c3, not queen b5, because the queen isn't attacking the queen. So that would have been a strong way of playing. The objective way to continue would be queen to a2, but then there's still rook c3 and rook c2, and winning the queen. So that would have been the winning plan, but it's definitely a very difficult thing to find with low time on the clock. Even with time on the clock, it's not so easy, and ultimately Vincent isn't able to find it, but he still tries to play on in a way that is maybe not the best. He allows this move rook to h7 check, and he should have actually gone king to g5 and just accepted that now his king will also be in some peril, but he decided to take and transition into a losing queen endgame where he's down a pawn, and ultimately Levon was able to convert the position quite cleanly after winning a pawn, and getting a clean 2-on-1. We got some checks, and then we had e6, which was ultimately what induced resignation. So very, very nice game by Levon. He was able to hold a position that was objectively lost, and he's one of the most resilient players in the middle game that you can think of. So definitely someone that you cannot assume you're going to just win a game against. Alright, so let's go ahead and take a look at the fourth game. Here we have a game between, MVL versus Sam Sevian, where we have a reverse Sicilian, um, and I'll just turn on the eval bar. Nothing particularly special. This is just theory, but these are kind of the main lines. We have bishop to b2, a4, knight to e1, a5, and here we get maybe at this moment there could have been a different move, knight to d5. Sam could have chosen this, trying to put some pressure on the c3 knight, and noting that this position would not be great for white because after something like rook b1, you can simply take on d5, and then you'll be winning this pawn on a5. Even I think bishop takes, just moving the bishop back would be fine, because you have the bishop pair. But Sam decided to opt for something else, where, apologies, somebody's sending me a challenge, but in he could have maybe opted for something else, but he opted for knight d7, which is a little bit more passive, but still objectively playable. And here we get knight takes, queen takes, and we get queen takes b2. So after knight takes b3, what happens is that we have rook to a3, and actually MVL ends up getting a very nice position because he's able to play the move knight to c4, where after captures, the rook is threatening to capture two pieces for the knights, or for itself rather, so then we get queen a2, and this concrete line is actually quite decent for MVL because even though he gives up this very strong bishop for the rook, there's actually not clear compensation for the exchange in this position, even though obviously the knights are quite active, and the diagonal is weak, but MVL correctly evaluates that it's not sufficient to completely compensate for the given up exchange. And here we end up getting the sequence where there's a desperado for the queen being attacked, rather the queen being attacked, and then we have a trade. So this is actually still equal, because the knight on c4 is so strong, and the black does have a pawn to go with it, but rook to d8 was not the correct move because MVL had this very nice shot, rook to a8, where we get a fork on d5, and trading one pair of rooks makes this position much easier to deal with. And MVL ultimately chose to take on b5. Maybe he could have also transitioned to the queen endgame, to the rook versus knight endgame, but I think he wanted to try and keep pieces on the board with Sam having such low time. I think it's probably the better practical choice. And ultimately, after h6, rook to c1, it wasn't maybe the cleanest conversion. I think probably Sam could have maybe still held on if he had played the move knight to d6, where if something like queen to d5, then knight f7 is actually somewhat holding everything. It's kind of a fortress, and it's not so clear how you're going to break through, but it's not an easy thing to really conceptualize, because you still feel like somehow white should be getting some kind of play on the back rank, but really concretely they don't have much. So even this position is ultimately a draw. But black would not trade. They play something like queen to d7. And I guess the point is just that there's no checks on h8, and the only way that maybe you could get back rank stuff to work would be with the queen leading the battery, but that's not really easy to execute without allowing some perpetuals. So ultimately what we get is this move knight to e5, and Sam misses that after queen to e8, he will actually not be able to keep giving checks. So he probably thought that after queen a6, king to g2 would be played maybe, and then there's some queen e2 check, where at the very least he has a draw. With this, he's actually winning, but the thing is that after king to g1, he runs out of checks because queen to b6, king to g2, and the king simply runs away. The point being that there's no check on e2 anymore because the light squares that you can check from don't have access to that square. So the white king is able to hide. Same thing if queen a1 check were to have been played, then the white king would simply run away. And ultimately, Sam ends up resigning the game, so MVL gets a very nice win as well. Very clean game. And we'll move on to the fourth game, which is between Alexandra Kostenuik and Carissa. Both players that no, actually, only Kostenuik played in the Speed Chess Championship, but Carissa has played in previous iterations of the event, I believe, and also she is the reigning winner of the Cairns Cup. So she is definitely looking to defend her title, though I believe she did start off over 1 against Zhongyi, who is the previous Women's World Chess Championship challenger. So not an easy pairing in the first round, so she's definitely looking to get right back on the board. And Carissa goes for e4, e5, where we get a Petrov. Alexandra trying to maybe neutralize the game, but we still get some dynamics here, which Carissa tries to exploit by playing as aggressively as possible. Let me just turn on the eval bar. Hope I had it on for the other game. Yeah. Okay, so we have these moves h3, g4, which are actually playable in this situation because the dark squares, even though they are a little bit weakened, the black bishop is a little bit too passive at the moment to really deal with, rather to really punish that. So white can try to use their development edge to maybe create some chances in the game. And we get a reroute of the knight to b5. Carissa plays c4, and she has actually some nice central control. We have knight to f4, and Carissa's just playing this in a very positional way. After knight takes e6, she actually has quite a nice position, nearly a winning one, with all the pressure that's mounting on d6. And the issue is that Kostenuik can't really play pawn to d5 because there's knight e5 at the very least, but also there's g6, and if knight h5, then there's g5, and then there's g6. And if takes, this is just a bad situation for black because of the weakness of the king. And if they push h6, then this pawn is simply taking up all the key squares from the black king. Otherwise, threat is to capture on h7, so black is in some severe trouble there. Ultimately, that's why Kostenuik plays for pawn to c5, and we get knight to e4, and this is still holdable, but Alexandra is down to 1 minute on the clock, and she allows this pawn to go to g6, trying to maybe create some counterplay with d5, where you can't capture back, but what she planned on was playing this move pawn to e5. However, she missed this very, very nice resource, which Carissa found, which is pawn to d6. And the point being that after takes, there is queen to c4 check, and if the rook blocks, then we get this move rook takes e5, and if the king goes to h8, then we have bishop to f4, and the threat is now rook h3, simply picking up material, in particular picking up the queen, because there's no other way to defend from checkmate. So the game concludes with rook to e5, rook takes e5, and we get some pressure on the rook, f4, and after rook to g5, Alexandra Kostenuik resigns. They both passed 40 moves and reach time control, so the reason this is winning is because now after rook takes e6, there's rook f5, king to e7, bishop h4, king to d7, and now rook to d5 check is winning. Otherwise, they could play king to d6, but this is still losing because there is queen to a6 check, and after, if king c7, you simply pick up the rook. If king to d7, then there's queen b7, king to d6, queen b6, king to d7, and I believe the point is after this we have queen b8, king c6, king. If this, then there's rook f7 check, and now the king is beginning to get hunted. So at the very least, we have something like this, and now I think simply queen b7 check would pick up material. So all of these lines would end up just being winning for black, for white, and if we have something like king to c6 here, then there's queen c8 check, and now the issue is that if you go here, then there's queen d8 check picking up the queen. So you're going to lose the rook, or you are going to lose the queen. Regardless, it's a winning position. I'm sure Carissa had calculated everything out, and maybe not that line, but some other line that she found more clean. She had 30 minutes on the clock, so Alexandra simply resigns in that position. Maybe there's also some stuff with f4 that could have been played, but I guess here there's queen e2 check, just trading queens. So still have to. So maybe there was some accuracy required, but Alexandra ended up resigning. So very nice game by Carissa. We missed a 1 out of 2. And in this next game, we are taking a look at a game between Wesley and Jorden van Foreest. Jorden was in quite good form to start 2026. He did beat Magnus Carlsen, but in the St. Louis Rapid and Blitz, he also had kind of a bad event. I don't believe he got a single win, or maybe I'm mistaking that with Anish, but he didn't do particularly well. And Wesley has been in pretty decent form throughout 2026, and actually after this game, he ends up moving to world number 5. So he's definitely in quite decent form, and we get this opening, this Slav defense, where after these moves, Wesley actually decides to sacrifice on b5, with the point that if takes, then bishop takes b5. If knight to d7, then this move actually just wins the piece back at the very least, and same thing, if bishop blocks, then there's still c6 even, but there's also knight takes first and then c6. So this was Wesley's idea, so he's winning a pawn, but Jorden is arguing that he has pretty decent compensation in the fact that Wesley is underdeveloped when he goes for this. However, Wesley is able to maintain the pawn for quite a while, and ultimately what happens is he maintains it for so long that he ends up getting an exchange that benefits him for the resulting rook endgame, and he ends up a pawn up. Now it's still a draw, but it's not so clear, and here Jorden makes the key mistake. He had to play king f7 or king f6 to try and ensure that this white king would not be able to get in as easily. So it's something like king c6. Now at least this pawn is kind of blockaded, and this rook has some flexibility. And also the main key point is that this h pawn is actually defended. What happened in the game was that after rook c1, the thing is that after king b5, rook to b1 check, or rather after king to f6, the issue is that now there is c6, rook to b1 check, king to a6, or sorry, king to c5 is made more accurate, and then if king to e6, then rook to d6, king to e5, and now rook h6 will pick up this pawn, and the king is just a bit cut off. So even if rook c1 check, king to b6, you can try to play for something like king to d5, but now there's simply c7. And the thing is that this pawn is also always going to fall, so this extra pressure just is the reason for the position being lost. And we get king to b5, king to a6, and then ultimately white is able to run the king up. Jorden's down to a couple minutes, but not really a holdable position against someone as strong as Wesley, so he resigns in this position where Wesley is going to be pushing his pawn, and there's not really a good way to stop it. One thing to note is that even if black was able to get something like a5, the issue is that after c6, rook to b8, even though like white could just always capture, but the main point I want to illustrate is that after something like c7, rook to c8, king to d7, even or okay, sorry, I'll say like this, even something like this, where you get a position that the pawn is kind of pushing in, is actually not going to be winning, or it's not going to be holding for black, because even if black tries to push the pawn all the way, the problem is that the king is so far cut off that it can actually not come to help protect the pawn, so the rook would simply be able to capture it. So very well played game by Wesley. Let's move on to the game between Zhongyi and Humpy Koneru. Both very strong players, slightly older, but they have still had quite a bit of success in this decade, and they're still very strong at the present moment. So we have moves bishop to d3 and bishop to b2, where Tan is trying to play this in kind of a slower setup. Tan is the former Women's World Chess Championship chess challenger, so she definitely has some preparation left over. Not sure if this is part of it, but she likely is a very well prepared player. And she gets bishop f5, rook to c8, a4, and she moves her bishop quite a few times, but ultimately it becomes active. And Humpy maybe here should have tried to play for the move bishop to d5 and neutralize the bishop, but ultimately the position was already a little bit unpleasant, and queen to g6 was actually a mistake, where now she allowed this move b4 with some tactics that there's bishop f7, picking up the rook. If takes, so we have bishop to c6 and rook to d2, now bishop to e5, and Humpy decided to sacrifice the exchange to try and get some counterplay, but ultimately Tan was able to consolidate her advantage and won the black queen, so she's up a queen for 2 bishops and was able to relatively smoothly convert this game. She sacked her rook to just simplify the position to a more cleanly winning one, where it's queen versus rook and bishop, and she ends up picking up another pawn. And eventually, we simply got resignation here by Humpy because white will simply advance these pawns. With the help of the queen, there's not really any counterplay to be orchestrated, so very well played game by Tan. And let's go ahead and take a look at the last 3 games, which were a little bit less eventful, but still worth analyzing. So here we had a Rogozin defense between Anish and Fabi, and Anish played this in kind of a solid way. He played this bishop f6 line. I've tried to prepare the Rogozin a little bit myself as black. It's a very solid defense, so if you're looking for a solid weapon, then I think the Rogozin is just for you. Rather, a solid weapon that is still dynamic and kind of sharp. The thing with these top players is they know all the theories, so they're going into this line where black is accepting that they're going to be a pawn down, but the c pawn being weak and black's activity kind of compensate that, and Anish ultimately decides not to take too much risk. He tries to just trade the rooks on b1 and accept the exchange of pawns, or rather accept that it'll be equal pawns by giving back his extra one. And he does maybe get some play here where he's kind of constricting the king side a bit, but ultimately Fabi finds his active move f6, where now there's not so much left in the position. After king f7, the rook simply has to move, and now we get some activity by black, and ultimately the position fizzles out to a draw, where here white is threatening to play knight to d7, so black has to move the king, but now white is a pawn down, so they can repeat, and they would like to repeat. Ultimately, this game ends in a draw, so interesting choice of opening. Anish is playing very solidly, not something completely unexpected, but Fabi still has 1.5 out of 2, so he's doing relatively well in this tournament. He had that famous 7-0 streak in the Sinquefield Cup, so he's probably looking to have a performance somewhat similar to that. So here we have a game between Bibisara and Vaishali, both strong grandmasters, and we get an Italian game. My favorite opening, but not in this specific variation, because I don't play the fried liver attack. I like to just play the regular slow Italian. Bibisara decided to go for this sharp bishop to b5 check line, where typically the main line is to play c6, and you get this Poliero position where black has kind of taken the center and white is a little bit miscoordinated, where this bishop kind of prevents the dark square bishop from developing, and the knight on g5 is a little bit misplaced. Black has some good development, so they try to compensate for being a pawn down, but typically the main lines fizzle out to draw. However, Vaishali chooses to go for bishop to d7, maybe trying to be a little bit ambitious, and we get this capture on e5, and ultimately the position is kind of fizzling a little bit, though white is a pawn up. However, black has a decent bit of development that compensates for that lost pawn, and actually black gets more active here, and we have bishop takes b4, queen f3, queen g2, and ultimately the position, white ended up winning this pawn earlier, or black ended up winning this pawn earlier, where white couldn't really develop in an easy way, so she tried to just force the liquidation so that there wouldn't be more pressure on the position. And ultimately, black is active, but black has a slightly split pawn structure, so both sides think it's worth just taking the draw here. Which makes sense because it is objectively quite an equal position. So, relatively solid game from both players. And let's go ahead and move on to the last game, which was between the only international master in either event, Stavroula Tsolakidou, I think. I'm not sure if I'm fully pronouncing that correctly. If somebody knows how to pronounce that correctly, please let me know in the comments. I'll try to get it right for next video regardless. But she is on half a point out of 1. And she's playing Anna Muzychuk, who I believe has challenged for the World Chess Championship, or Women's World Chess Championship before. So both very strong players. And here we get the ready system employed by Stavroula, and Anna is going for this Slav-esque setup with c6, where she decides to take on c4. And I think this is actually quite a good setup. I used to play this quite a bit in online rapid chess, where the c-pawn is actually objectively one that causes some problems in white's position. The reason I don't play it as often anymore is just because it does require a little bit of prep, but if you are well prepped in it, then it is objectively a very good try for black, and it's just a better position for black. So I'm honestly going to probably try and review it once more, because I think I would like to reincorporate it into my own repertoire. But if you're looking for a good defense against the King's Indian type setup, then this is certainly one that you can consider. But here we have bishop to a6 by black, trying to get active, and we have the move pawn to e5, which is maybe not the most ambitious move. It's just arguing that white has to try and take with the pawn, because if they take with the knight, then the d4 pawn hangs. So if they want to play for anything, they have to take with the d pawn, but then the pawns are doubled, and it's kind of just a game that will fizzle out. Or rather, it's a game where the pawns are weak enough that it's just dynamically equal. And here there's maybe one moment where white could have tried to play for rook to d1, and this pawn on e4 can't be captured because of rook to d4. So the pawns could have temporarily stayed in the center and created some sort of clamp, but ultimately Stavroula decided to opt against it and play bishop to c3, which gave us this tactic knight takes f2, and we kind of got rook c1 and an equal position where white gets active even though they're down a pawn, and we get a trade, which ultimately becomes an equal position and a draw by repetition. So very nice games to start off this tournament. I didn't make a recap for the round 1 of the tournament because I thought that maybe there would be some other videos or other channels that would be covering the event, but I haven't seen so many other channels. So just as a person that likes to watch these events and follow along, I wanted to make a video where other people would be able to enjoy the games as well. So I'll be making recaps for the upcoming rounds as well. This round did occur yesterday, so this is a bit of a later video. I did try to record yesterday a bit after the round ended, but I was having some issues with my audio, so I believe that should be fixed. If you think there are some issues still, let me know. But otherwise, hope you have a good day. If you like the content of this channel, feel free to like and subscribe. But otherwise, I will see you in the next recap. Take care.